Hey everybody, Ross Perot died today at 89, and I think he has a political legacy that's worth reflecting on. I remember in 2016, during that presidential cycle, there were a bevy of media articles and narratives being propounded that theorized that Ross Perot really was the precedent for Trump in terms of the issues that they emphasized, in terms of aspects of their political style, in terms of being a wealthy businessman who was intruding into electoral politics and trying to upend the system. Because if you recall, at least early on in the 2016 cycle, it was speculated that Trump might run as a third-party candidate if he didn't get the Republican nomination, or that he was going to blow up the Republican firmament and mounting this hostile takeover of the party that was going to end Republican politics as we know it. Now, it turns out that was a little bit overblown, actually a lot overblown. In terms of his governance, Trump really has given most of the Republican institutional apparatus exactly what they wanted, especially with regard to judgeships. Most of his domestic policy agenda was perfectly in keeping with the pre-existing Republican honchos like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. Now, there have been some deviations here and there on foreign policy, in particular North Korea, arguably Syria, and then perhaps trade. But in the main, Trump really is consonant with what the Republican Party stood for even prior to Trump's ascendance, and that is in some sense to Trump's discredit, because he had an opportunity to really break through long-standing partisan binaries and hasn't really governed with that in mind for a whole variety of reasons. That's a longer conversation. But the point is, in 2015, 2016, Ross Perot was frequently cited as a precursor to Trump in a way. So I can remember thinking during that time period, okay, this is at least a plausible theory. Why haven't I seen Ross Perot anywhere in the media commenting on Trump, giving his insights as to what Trump stands for? Now, Perot was old at the time, in his mid to late 80s, but he was alive. He was cognizant, it seemed. He was doing occasional public events, and he was last interviewed, as far as I can tell, in 2016 and perhaps even later. So it wasn't as if he was totally receded from public life. And remember, Ross Perot first ran in 1992, but he ran again in 1996. And in 1996, Ross Perot founded the Reform Party, and that was the ticket on which he ran in 1996. And then 4 years later, who else but Donald Trump sought the Reform Party nomination? That's when Trump was running for president that year. And he ran against Pat Buchanan. They had lots of nasty backs and forths. But, it never really went anywhere. But nonetheless, you would think that Trump running to be Perot's successor would have given Perot some insights into, maybe not Trump personally, I don't know if they knew each other on a personal level, but at least politically. And that you saw virtually nothing from Perot on Trump. It's actually the one prominent political figure that I would have liked to hear expound on Trump and the meaning of Trump, so to say, who never really gave any public comments as far as I know. If you've seen those comments, send them to me, because I actually have not seen them, and I've looked. But Perot, he gave his thoughts on politics even well into his later years. He endorsed Mitt Romney pretty strongly in 2008 and 2012. He endorsed George W. Bush in 2000, sort of on the eve of the election, which was actually a somewhat significant boost to Bush, because as anybody who's passingly familiar with Ross Perot ought to know, he ran against Bush's father in 1992. And the H.W. Bush team blamed Perot for their loss. Now, whether Perot actually is responsible for Bush's loss is a matter of contention. I think that there's actually a very oversimplified caricature of Perot that has him siphoning votes exclusively from Bush and therefore costing him the election. There's actually been a lot of scholarship on this in the subsequent years, which suggests that Perot actually had a very heterodox coalition electorally. And there were aspects of his coalition that seemed to actually more disadvantage Bill Clinton in 1992. So the argument has been made that if anybody was disadvantaged by Perot in 1992, it was actually Bill Clinton, not Bush. But then again, it's hard to really say with complete certainty because there are all kinds of variables, and you can never prove a counterfactual. Meaning, if Perot never ran, Bush would have won. That's what a lot of Republicans still think now. But needless to say, he's a major figure in political lore, and so for him not to weigh in at all on Trump in 2016 was a bit odd. So I tried to speculate as to why that might be. And I have been familiar with Perot for years, obviously, but something occurred to me today about why he never weighed in on Trump, whereas he weighed in on other political figures. And remember, Trump, at least nominally, was in line with Perot's agenda. Anti-NAFTA, is more skeptical of trade more generally than your average business-oriented Republican. Both obviously kind of swashbuckling billionaire types, etc. But Perot actually was very insistent on subscribing to traditional morality, let's say. And that's not to make a normative claim as to whether his traditional morality was good or bad, but that's part of his identity, or was. So, for example, at the businesses he ran, he imposed a moral code on his employees where they were prohibited from having extramarital affairs. He was very scornful of adultery. He said in 1992 that he would not appoint knowingly any adulterers to his administration. And he would later call Bill Clinton unfit for office on account solely of his adulterous affairs. Now, obviously, Perot had other criticisms of Clinton. That's why he ran against him twice. But Perot said on Larry King in 1998 that the fact of Bill Clinton's personal deviancies alone disqualified him from being regarded as fit for office. So that might be a reason why Perot maybe wasn't willing to weigh in Trump's favor, because, Trump was a philanderer. He was married 3 times, blah, blah, blah. Everybody knows the story. Perot also always required personal modesty, at least, especially in dress for women and men. So maybe a beauty pageant proprietor like Trump is not somebody who is naturally in sync with a Perot type. So just in terms of personal mores, you could understand why Perot might not have felt motivated to say anything positive about Trump, although he didn't say anything negative either. He kind of just abstained. He might have been the only person in America of any political clout who abstained from weighing in on the 2016 election. But there are other aspects of Trump's legacy that of Perot's legacy that are interesting. In terms of an electoral corollary, one really interesting factoid is to look at how Perot performed in Maine in 1992, and then how Trump performed in Maine 24 years later. Maine was the one state where Perot actually defeated one of the 2 major candidates, Bush and Clinton, in overall popular vote. Perot received a greater share of the popular vote in Maine than George H.W. Bush. Now, Clinton ended up winning the state, and he won both of the congressional districts, so it didn't make a difference in terms of the Electoral College. But it showed that there was an appetite, especially in that region, for whatever Perot was promoting, kind of, for lack of a better word, protectionism, not quite isolationism, but having an alternate perspective on foreign affairs, anti-trade, etc. And I don't use those terms as a pejorative because I think they're legitimate perspectives. But 24 years later, Trump competed in those very same pockets of Maine, especially in the north of Maine and in rural areas, where Perot overperformed. And sure enough, Trump won the 2nd Congressional District of Maine, which entitled him to one electoral vote, given how Maine allocates its electoral votes by congressional district. Only one of 2 states to do so, the other being Nebraska. And that was the first time in history that Maine split its electoral votes in that manner. So you can actually draw a through line, at least in terms of results, electorally between Perot and Trump. And that is actually pretty interesting, and I think warrants further study. It also should be emphasized, and I mean, and you see this when you read the obituaries, but it really should be, I think, underscored, that Ross Perot was the most successful independent candidate for president in the entire history of the United States. I mean, that's hugely significant. He was not a third-party candidate, technically, really, when he ran in 1992. He didn't have a party. He ran simply as an independent. And he won a greater share of the vote in 1992 than any non-Republican or Democratic candidate had since 1912. And that was Theodore Roosevelt, who ran on the Bull Moose Party ticket. He was a former president, obviously, so he was ubiquitously known. So for Ross Perot, this kind of eccentric billionaire to come out of nowhere and really make that strong of a showing should have been a forerunner to the kind of fluidity that we see in American politics now. And some people recognized that at the time, but it kind of all got subsumed into traditional, kind of partisan politics. Ross Perot got 18.9% in 1992. Obviously didn't win any electoral votes, but 18.92% of the vote is almost 20 million votes. And the guy didn't have a party. He didn't have an apparatus behind him. He later founded a party in 96, but he actually did worse in 96 when he had a party, by a lot. So it's actually a very significant phenomenon that, it got a lot of study, but it's kind of gotten lost to memory now. And I don't know whether Trump will comment on Perot. I don't know if he has yet, but Bernie Sanders did, hilariously. Bernie Sanders tweeted earlier today a photo of an Excalibur sword that Perot gave to Bernie as a gift sometime when Bernie was in Congress. I couldn't, looking at the photo, tell what year it was from. My guess would be in the 90s. But that just shows you the kind of cross-partisan appeal that Perot really did have. If you look at the New York Times obituary, here's how they characterized Perot's support base. It came from across the spectrum, the New York Times said, from Republicans to Democrats, conservatives and liberals, mostly from the middle class. So you had everybody all across the spectrum who liked Perot for a variety of reasons, ranging from his kind of folksy and quirky personal style, to his blunt talk, to his amusing aphorisms, to the policy stuff. And for a successful presidential candidate, you need to have some kind of combination of those to resonate, and he did. But it's actually a reminder that you shouldn't be oversimplistic in terms of your takes as to what effect third-party candidates have. I remember in 2016, a lot of people were just blithely assuming that the presence of Gary Johnson in the race would draw more support from Trump than Hillary, and the results didn't really bear that out. I mean, the results were much more ambiguous. It's not clear. It's plausible if you really look into the data deeply that Gary Johnson actually disadvantaged Hillary more. So people don't have necessarily a coherent or a fully formed outlook when they're assessing which candidates to support. It's kind of sporadic. It's kind of based on randomness a lot of the times. It's almost based on kind of vague affinities rather than a kind of rational, dispassionate assessment of a policy agenda. So, Gary Johnson may have hurt Hillary more than he did Trump, and similar arguments could be made with regard to Perot. I mean, just because he was seen as a conservative and he was a Republican later on in his life doesn't mean that he actually cost Bush the presidency. Now, there were some aspects of Perot that obviously prevented him from winning the presidency. And in June of 1992, he was in the polls very close, within the margin of error in some, to the two main candidates, Bush and Clinton. But then, all of a sudden, pretty much out of nowhere, Perot dropped out. He later came back in October, but there was like a several-month time span where where Perot basically forfeited the huge advantages that he had, and the momentum behind him kind of receded. And if you look at why he dropped out, it's kind of hilarious. I mean, he essentially got bamboozled by a former police officer named, what's the name here? Sorry. Named Scott Barnes, who was a police officer in Southern California and apparently claimed that he had some vague involvement with the intelligence services, maybe the CIA, maybe something else, who knows. And Perot said that he would occasionally speak on the phone with this person. And Barnes convinced Perot that Republicans, who exactly we don't know, Perot was always kind of vague about this, that Republicans had launched this really intense and defamatory dirty tricks campaign to sabotage Perot's candidacy. And, they claimed that, or Perot claimed that the Republicans had photos of one of his daughters that were compromising and were actually going to physically disrupt his daughter's wedding by showing up to the wedding and disrupting it. So rather than subject his family to that potential torment, Perot dropped out of the race. And he later said that Republicans are known to go around disrupting events like this, and he actually speculated that a horde of neo-Nazis were going to be dispatched by the Republicans to disrupt his daughter's wedding. So Perot is obviously prone to some paranoia, kind of like Trump, and had dalliances with fringe characters, also kind of like Trump, and always thought that he was under siege. And I'm sure there were some people who wanted to take down Perot, but based on what we know about this incident that led him to drop out, it was a total fabrication. The former police officer Barnes said some years later that he made it up. It was a lie. And he basically successfully swindled Ross Perot and possibly cost him the presidency. Because if Perot had remained in the race all throughout that summer into the fall, he potentially could have carried on the momentum that he had built up and, if not won the presidency, come closer than he did, even though he did historically well. One aspect of Perot's legacy that doesn't get talked about as much is his foreign policy views. Perot was the only major presidential candidate in 1992 to actually question the Gulf War, which was then regarded as a grand patriotic triumph. And Perot was prescient on that issue because he just kind of, on an instinctive level, seemed to recognize the illogic of the entire enterprise. And here's what he said in June of 1992, when he was kind of at the peak of his popularity and was getting a lot of traction to the point where he was seen as a possible victor in that fall's presidential election. He said this on the Today Show when he was taking phone calls and somebody asked him to comment on the Gulf War. He said, "We need to take these things apart, put them under a microscope and say, wait a minute, what happened here? For 10 years, we created Saddam Hussein with your taxpayer money. Our president was sending delegations over to burp and diaper and pamper Saddam Hussein and tell him how nice he was. That's all public record. Then our manhood was questioned, and off we go into the wild blue yonder with the lives of our servicemen at risk because of 10 years of stupid mistakes and billions of dollars of taxpayer money." That's 100% right. And that's an indictment of the bipartisan foreign policy consensus at the time. Bush and Clinton that year were essentially united on the wisdom and virtue of the Gulf War. Now, Bush did attack Clinton here and there for not being sufficiently enthusiastic about the Gulf War, but Clinton supported it. and was pretty clear about that. So if they were apart at all, it was just by very, very minor gradations, whereas Ross Perot was saying the whole thing was a joke and phony. And obviously that resonated in the public to a large degree. So there you have it. Those are some thoughts on Ross Perot, R.I.P., and I'll talk to you later.